So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this follow-up session to our workshop. And I'm delighted to be here today. And I am going to take you through in more detail a topic that many of you in your feedback indicated you wanted more information about. So I thought it would be helpful if I actually opened up the same model we had started with. But what I'm going to do that's different is I'm going to walk you through all of the data sets and all of the data models that support this particular interpretation. Now, I am, full warning, telling you that I am not doing this as a sales tool for this particular methodology. This is the methodology we use with clients who engage us to do that. This isn't a sales pitch. This is actually teaching you how we do this for clients using this particular tool, but it will give you insight into how you can build your own model on your own. And I think will give you detailed access to some of the ideas from the original workshop. So my intent in using my tool is because I know it and because I have it and I have access to it. So it allows me to use it as a teaching tool. And if you decide that this is something of interest you want to talk to me about separately, feel free, but that's not the intent of the workshop today. Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. One of the things that we know both the SEC and NIST 2.0 require is that you, as the person responsible for security, or if you're the CTO, so whether you're the CISO, the CTO, you may be a chief compliance officer, whatever role you play, somebody has made the decision, either you or the company, that you are responsible somehow for security. And as a result of that, the requirements of NIST today indicate the need to establish a threshold, that is a tolerance for risk, and that has to be expressed in both the likelihood of breach and the cost of a breach. Now, the challenge with that is we've all notionally forever known that the way we attract investment into security for an enterprise is the threat that something bad could happen. Right? That makes sense, right? We live in this world where we know this event can happen. But if we do
James,
our job, yeah,
sorry, can I interrupt you just for 1 second? It
sure.
looks as though your text messages are on the right-hand side. I'm not sure whether you want those
Oh,
displayed on the screen.
that's fine. Those are just that's just from my teams. So I can do that. So there you go. Thank you. So the important thing to remember is that if we do our job well, that event never happens. And that is the real challenge of our business. If we are good at it and the event itself never happens, the question sometimes arises, well, we must be safer than we think. The reason that, in my view, both of these agencies have moved towards the idea of tolerances and risks and the idea of having an understanding of your risk posture is because we can never lose sight of the possibility the event could have and what it would cost us. All right. So it's important to actually embed this, not in a way that makes the organization afraid, but in a way that gives it access to information to make decisions about what we call a return on security investment. All right, so Ted, I'm gonna pick on you. So we're actually going to do this we're gonna fill it in as if this was you. Is that okay? Okay, you're gonna need to unmute because you're gonna give me
Yeah,
some
that's
answers.
good.
There
Thanks.
we go. All right, so we know that Ted is in Canada, so we're gonna pick Canada. And then Ted, we're gonna pick an industry, and I think we can safely say that's education.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, now you're gonna give me the rest of this. So how many people does your company employ?
We are in the 1,000 to 5,000.
Perfect. And how many customers are paying for your products? Now, in your case, what's your student enrollment?
Student enrollment is 10,000 to 50,000.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. So we're going to do
right.
that. And annual revenue, so your top line tuition and
Yeah,
grants would be
180 million.
perfect. So we're going to put you in 100 million. There we go. And of course, we do know that that's you. So we're going to say yes. And we're going to assume that Ted is, we know, very competent at what he does. So that's excellent. You are not a public company. That will become important. Now, let's pause there because this is the first one that may be anti-intuitive. Up to this point, everything should be fairly intuitive, right?
Yeah,
Demographic. We also know that by having what we call a locus of control, there's a lot of research that suggests by having an actual CISO, so by not having the CTO do double duty, by having somebody who is a security expert and who is responsible, changes the nature of the organization's understanding of the risk, because they've made an investment in somebody who's responsible for that. So that's why the previous question. The public company status has to do with reporting if a breach occurs. So if you were a public company, the first thing I'm going to say to you is watch what happens when you do that, because the breach impact may take a minute or two. There you go.
Oh,
The
wow.
breach impact nearly doubles, and I'll tell you why that happens. A publicly traded company has layers of reporting responsibility that a private company does not have in most jurisdictions. So if you were publicly traded, the SEC is a good example. It amps up the degree to which you have to report and the degree to which you have to report on the mitigation. So it provides 2 layers of reporting that is not necessarily true for a private company. A private company needs only to mitigate the thing. So we're going to leave you at no. Even though you're in the public sector, this doesn't mean you would answer yes, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether you fall under the regulations of, for instance, the SEC or the TSE as an example. Okay. Now, that gives us right up here what we call raw scores. So breach likelihood and breach impact. This is done exclusively on your demographics. So this is before we apply any mitigation by the company. So the reason it's your raw score is it's, if you like, your starting point if you had done nothing and you were a sitting duck. So far, so good, Ted?
Yeah.
Now, before we get to the implementation groups, which are the company data types, let me show you where this information came from, because I think it's important whenever we use an information source that we're confident and we can describe that to our executive peers or to the board, right? If you had a question about, well, where did this data come from? How reliable is this data? Where did you get it? So let's go and actually look at the database where this came from. And this is information that I didn't share in the workshop, not because I didn't want to, and not because it's proprietary, it's clearly not, I'm showing it here, but because we didn't have time, because you can see the complexity of this underlying data model, right? But it's not as complex as it looks at first glance. So let's unpack it. Up at the very top left of your screen, do you see the 3 things, the weighted average, the likelihood, and the estimated dollar impact? Do you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Those are raw scores that come primarily from public data sources. And by public data sources, let me give you an example of one. So we use, as an example, and embedded throughout this chart, I can tell you where all these data sources are. This is the actual data model itself, and we'll get into that in a second. But I want to show you some of the sources that anybody can use. This doesn't require that you rely on CyberCon IQ. You can use public sources for this. So as an example, have you seen this before, Ted?
I'm not sure.
Okay,
No,
this
I
is the
don't think
IBM. Okay, so a lot of people haven't. This is the cost of a data breach report by IBM. It is available to anybody free. You have to give them your email address. This is one of the best, in my view, most reliable, most thoroughly researched breach reports in the world. It has tens of thousands of participating companies across all geographies, orchestrated by IBM, primarily from their client set, although so close to 80% of the responses are from people in their client set, but they still have 22, 23% of non-clients. So this is what we would call a large data sample report. And the reason that makes it reliable, of course, is that the more countries and the more customers you have reporting their actual experience to a trusted party, the more likely this is a reliable estimate. Would we agree, Ted? That's just sort of basic science, right?
Yeah,
Basic
for sure.
statistics.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what's really neat about that report. And again, why IBM doesn't trumpet this from the top of its marketing hills, I don't understand. You have to kind of know how to find this. But what I can assure you is if you type in cost of a data breach report, IBM 2024, you will get it, and you can download it just as easily as me.
Yeah.
Now, do you see it on your screen as I'm moving through it? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So look at this rich data set. Global trends, attack vectors, costs, disruption, recovery time, factors. This is like gold, because this gives us a starting point. Even if we didn't do anything else in your company, if you even just lifted this, nobody, as we used to say, we used to joke, Cindy and Barry, I'm sure you'll both smile. If your cameras were on, I would see you smiling. But the phrase that I certainly grew up with when I was a tech executive, Ted, was nobody ever got fired for buying or hiring IBM, right? It was this kind of idea that it was a steady Eddie technical brand or technology brand that people trusted. So the chances are good if you say to executives on your board, well, I got this from a recurring annual study that's been done more than 10 years in a row that IBM has been doing with tens of thousands of clients around the world. Man, do we think that has credibility? So that's what I call provenance of data. What that means is we're picking data sources that are reliable and that if they were shown in the original, people would not be suspicious of, that they would necessarily accept. It doesn't mean you have to accept it lock, stock, and barrel, as I'm going to show you in a second, but it's a good starting point. The second thing I'll point out about this table of contents is they give you a little hint here. They actually don't do this alone. They actually use the Ponemon Institute, which is a really well-known research, an independent thought leader in technology. They actually participate in this to do the data analysis. So IBM decided that it needed an independent party to sort of verify the methodology. And there's an appendix at the end of this that describes what they did to scrub the data, clean the data, and try to keep it from being biased in IBM's favor, because a lot of people would be suspect, right, of this coming from a vendor typically. So let me just walk you through, and so you can just kind of dance over this. They do this every year. Here's the summary. They tell you what's new, what's going on. That's kind of all cool, but here's where I want to get to. We can just linger on these key findings because the key findings alone give us a really nice starting point for our own understanding of risk. And every single time they present any new finding in the report, they give you a complete description. So just look at these numbers and then read the descriptions. Plain language, easy stats, easy to understand, something that you could absolutely integrate into your own narrative for your executive and your board. Do you agree, Ted?
Yeah.
All right. So this is where you sort of get a lot of the highlights. But if you then go down into the actual report, the complete findings, what I'm going to show you is you'll get that. You'll get data graphs that longitudinally show trends in terms of how it's changed over time. These are all drawn from the same source, the same client set. You get things like the variations. People ask me, well, how do you figure out whether Canada's more targeted or less targeted, or the US is more or less? Look at this. I have cost of breach by country. I have probability by country. And so they've chosen to do this. Now, in our model, we've grouped some of these because we deal with international clients. We've grouped some of these, like we've taken, you know, Europe as a whole, the Middle East as a whole. So some of them have been grouped already, some of them haven't. My point is not that you don't have to massage the data to suit you. You may not even care, Ted. In your particular instance, you may only want entry number 6, which is Canada.
Yeah.
But here's what's really interesting. Canada is virtually identical to the number for the United States, right? It's 4.66. These are all converted to US dollars. So that's 4.66. Notice it's down from 2023, which is interesting. Lots of places are up. Canada happens to be down. That's a notable statistic, and so on and so forth. So that's what's important. You can find all kinds of data. So we're not going to linger inside all the data here, but all I'm going to tell you is so much of what you get. Here's relative industry data, right? Do we see how education is lower down in terms of likelihood? That's how we establish that. That's how we understand that
So I have a
healthcare and
question on
finance.
that,
Yeah.
James. So I could hear my board saying that's all good and fine, and that's
Yep.
quality data. But what about our sector?
Right. Well, that's so down here, look by education, third from the bottom.
What would I do with that
So
education?
here's what you can do. You can actually use this number instead of the general number. So if you notice here, this is the US number for education. You see it's 3.5 instead of 4.4. So what you can do is you can say, well, if in the US as an example, it's 4.4, but education is 3.5, you can do the math, right, Ted? So what you do is, and I've got my calculator open over here on my iPad. Oh, I had it. Let me just go back to it and get it back. So what you can do, Ted, and this is basic math, right? So what you can say is if the reported average is 4.4, but education is 3.5 as an example, you see that?
Yeah.
So what do you do? Well, that's pretty easy once the ad from my free calculator stops. I do love the way these things go down. All right. So what you do is you divide 3.5 divided by 4.4. And what you understand is that the cost of a breach in education is 79% of the average of a general attack. Now you have a specifically reliable number
Okay.
that's available for in sector, right? For in industry. So great question. But now do you see what we're doing? So this is what I said to people in my workshop that's now becoming clear. This is raw data that you need to then turn into your own data model. So Ted, everything you're going to be looking at, you're going to want to look at the degree to which that's education specific. And if you can't get an education specific number, then you either have to deal with the average or you have to do some math or look for a source specific to industry. So for instance, in banking, the more detailed information is going to be found in FSISEC. FSISEC is particular to banking. They collect data and statistics specifically for banking that are more detailed, more reliable, and presented in the language of banking. So if I was going to use a source and I was in the finance industry, I would probably use FSISEC in preference to IBM, or now I can do what we talked about. Remember we said, well, or take multiple data sources. So maybe you take the IBM report plus FSISEC, plus maybe the Verizon data breach report as an example. Let's go look at a different source. Do you see that now? Do you know about this one?
Nope. Verizon.
Okay. Verizon. Now, this is very US centric. So how we use this tool, because it's very US centric, we use this as 2 data points to look at IBM and Verizon to determine, Ted, whether the stats they provide are similar or close. So what we're doing is we now have a couple of data sources. When you start to have more than 2 reliable data sources, you can start to do some interesting things. You could use an average of the two, or you could look at the methodology and the comprehensiveness of the study and say, well, maybe I prefer the IBM for this, or I prefer Verizon for that, or, you're starting to get a sense of what I was talking about in the particular context of cyber. There is not one size fits all answers. This is about sensing, discovering, looking for the data, and we call that intercorrelation of data sources. So what we're doing is we're looking to gain information about what happened and then to take that into a data model that we make ours. So Verizon, as an example, would be US centric. I believe, although I don't know for sure, you could probably find a similar kind of data set in Canada, maybe from one of the telcos, or maybe, I don't know, I haven't looked. But if you could or you couldn't, the point is you now have been alerted to the fact that so much of this information is publicly available and you can find it in lots of reliable sources.
There is a report that I referenced to the board from Sophos specific to
Great.
higher ed. The fact that they are a security company, does that give it more credibility or less, or is it just very subjective?
Great question. So to a large extent, it depends on whether the data has been independently collected and analyzed and verified. So one of the things I like about both Verizon and IBM is that they have a partner and they're specifically trying to amp up the confidence that this is not vendor specific. The problem with a lot of vendor driven research is it will be tilted towards creating a white paper they use for marketing. So we have to separate.
That's right.
That is the danger. So again, that's data provenance, right? You have to look at the lens through which research has been conducted. And where you can, try to find out what their methodology was. Were they only, as an example, surveying their own clients and asking self-serving questions, or are they reporting data that supports the use of their tool? So we don't use much vendor data. The 2 biggest that we do use, Verizon and IBM, we use them because they're independent. But you know what, Ted? You can then compare the industry specific data that you got from Sophos to the average data. Even that could be interesting, right? How close are they, or how far are they?
Yeah.
What insights does that give you, and so on. All right, so I want to pause there. So we've looked at a couple of the data sources in the original, and then we've gone over here and I've started to show you what we do. And all we're doing is taking one or more of those data sources and turning it into a chart. Now, in our case, we need it to be much broader than what you will need. You will not, as an individual client, have a data model this complicated. But what you are going to do is you're going to zero in on data that's important to you. So in your case, Ted, we would probably isolate most of the data sources to Canada. That would already simplify the model that's down on the far side, right? Because you wouldn't have to have all those countries. You would just have to have Canada. And you might zero in on sources of reports that have a little more akin to your actual employment size, and so on and so forth. So, and then we're applying some math in here that is transformational. So that when you move from a data source to a data model, what I meant in the workshop and what I mean here is that you take the raw data and you convert it into analysis that suits your particular organizational context. So what you're building is a data model specifically for you. And they're your data sources, they're your industry, they're your size, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what happens. And then you work that down until you get to the raw probability and cost before we do any mitigation for your industry. And that's basically how it works. So let's pause there and make sure. I mean, it's we're 20 minutes in, but already hopefully that has lifted the veil on how we do the basic tolerances around risk and probability. Has that helped you figure that out?
Well, that's good.
Okay. Okay. Now we move in the data model. So I'm going to go back to where we were. So the other thing we chose to use, now it's a choice. There are several ways you can deal with the complexity, because even an organization that answers all 7 of these demographic questions, Ted, I think we would agree, you could have 2 colleges, or you could have the differences between, say, a K-12 school and a college, or college and university, or so organizations then have a complexity to them, right? Or not. They could be a little simpler or a little more complicated. If you're in a university, you're probably going to have a higher intensity of research. Does that make sense? So you're going to have a different profile of risk around different kinds of things you might have. You might have deeper intellectual property concerns or whatever. So we have chosen at CyberCon to use the implementation groups that actually come from CIS. And they are in a 3-part data model. So there's 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3, and it's all based on the types of data that your company interacts with. So this gives us an indication of whether somebody is more or less complicated. So we could go through now. I'm not going to force you to do this, Ted, but you can understand how if we were to answer these questions about the college, they would give us insight into just how complicated your organization is in terms of the types of data, record types, and the sensitivity of those records. That's what this is collecting. So again, you don't have to go through this exercise more than once. You'll be able to establish so each of you who are attending today and who may see this in the recording, each of you is going to be able to make your own assessment about the degree to which you have different kinds of data that's protected, as an example, things that you are required by law to keep to yourself. If you're under FERPA in the US, and if you're in education, I'm sure there's a Canadian equivalent. You've got Canadian privacy guidelines, PI and that stuff versus employee records. You know, there's all of these nuances. So basically what we're trying to get to is how complicated are we, and how risky and complicated would a breach be to report out to various authorities. So that's a decision each of you needs to make. Now, again, back over to the data set. If I were to go over here, what I'm going to show you over on the far side over here is when we get to the implementation models, here, we have turned those questions over here. Do you see this? These data sets are attributable to a value. So either you have them or you don't. And then if you have them, the degree to which you have lots or few of these indicates whether you jump up from, say, a 3, which is a lower level, to a 2 or a 1. So these are known as escalations. What basically happens is if you increase the number of different data types you have, or the amount of those data, or as an example, the number of jurisdictions. In the United States, we have something you don't deal with, Ted, but for our colleagues listening in the United States, because we have to report data breaches by state, if you operate across the country, you are going to absolutely fall into one almost almost instantly, because if you have a data breach at your company level, you are going to have almost 50 states that you need to report into. In the United States, that's a problem because all the regimes, all the paperwork, all the requirements, all the notification rules, they're all different. That increases dramatically your cost of a breach on notification or remediation. If you're in, say, Canada, you might have only BC to worry about, Ted. That's possible, right? Maybe it's primarily BC, or maybe it's BC and a little bit of federal. But my point is, countries vary. So this is not information that I would necessarily have, but it's information that if a client tells me, I can back into this by looking at the complexity. And basically, it's a judgment about which of these groups you fall into. So I'm going to now say there is no magic bullet data answer here. There's only a defense of your conclusion based on information. So there's a difference between this model, which is making determinations about which category you sit into. This is categorical data. What you're doing is looking at the number of factors that you have, their presence and their weight, to determine what category you belong in. That is not a science so much as an art. So I'm going to reassure everybody on this call that it is important that we own that decision. That's okay, as long as you know how you got to it. What you don't want to do is say, oh yeah, we're a 3, or oh yeah, we're a 1. What you want to have is the backup for why you made the determination. You are going to make the determination. That's your responsibility. But you can point to specific factors. This is somewhat akin to what we talked about in the workshop around factor analysis. How many factors are present or absent that drive you to a conclusion about whether you are more or less risky and why? All right, I'm going to pause there and ask for any questions. So all we've done at this point is the demographics and the complexity of your organization to arrive at the starting point. And if we go back to that answer, and we'll put a few of these in, and we won't trigger any change in that, but we'll just, for the purposes of the model, say you've got a bunch of this stuff, whatever, okay? And so this is the starting point. It's a raw score. Now, if everybody's ready, are you ready, Ted, to go to the next part?
Yeah.
Okay, and let me check in. Was that first part, was that valuable in understanding how we got to that starting point?
Sure, I can comment. I think it just brings context to your point around specifically for your industry or your business. So I would agree. The model I would build would be much simpler. Yep. And I'm not like clearly this is built out as a consultant tool. Right. Mine would be very specific to, again, my business and the specifics of the organization. And now you have some idea of where to start to get those data sources and what to do with them when you find them to begin to make that data model for yourself, right? Yes. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Now we're going to go straight into NIST. So in order to do that, I need to alert, and there is a Canadian equivalent, Ted, to this, but of course, it's not nearly as built out as NIST. So what I recommend to my Canadian clients all the time is begin with NIST, then refine it for Canada. There are some differences because you have PIPEDA and some other things in Canada we don't have in the United States that you need to be aware of. But as a starting point, I think it is valuable to begin with NIST because the underlying frameworks in Canada are also based on NIST anyway. They're just Canadianized, okay? So it's a classic kind of example of go back to first source. Okay, so how you find it is you put into your browser NIST CSF, which is the cybersecurity framework. And if you put into your browser, and you do that right now, all of you watching this workshop, if you go to NIST CSF and you click on this, you will move rapidly to this, there we go. And that's the page you should see. So I first of all want to get everybody to this page. All right, Ted's there, that's great. Now, the CSF 2.0 Resource Center is the most valuable thing that, in my view, NIST has done in 2.0 that it did not originally do way back. For several reasons, you can always go and read the document, okay? So if you were to go and click on read the document, so if you were to do that on your computer, and you'll have to leave the NIST site to go and acknowledge that you're getting to their publication site, this is the actual framework itself. Now that framework is literally
hundreds of pages long if you click through and include all of the appendices. It is a dense, thorough document. You can click through all of these. They're layered. You can actually go back and read these. However, you may notice something as I'm paging through this. You may notice that what is here is all the actual detail of the standards, which is great. But note, no explanation. There is nothing here other than the specific standard in numerical order. Does that make sense? So it is totally the description of a framework, right? This is all this is. It's a framework. There is no detail attached to this. The detail is not found in this specific document. This is an explanation of how the framework works. Let me show you the two documents that we rely on the most, and they are, let me go back. They are first the profile. So if you were to go under and look at the 2.0 profiles, this is an incredibly valuable thing. Now, I've already clicked through and done that and gone to the top. So you can get to it by click on see the profiles. And if you do that up at the very top and you download this as an XLS file, you can actually manipulate this for your own organization. They've already done much of the hard work. So if you click on this and download it, you'll see it comes up as a manipulable spreadsheet. And what is really neat about this that is different than what we used to have, and I'm just going to go up to the top so you can see, they have done the hard work of bringing all of the standards from every single part of that framework, Ted, into a spreadsheet that you can now work on. I don't think clients ever understand the value of this. Now, I don't happen to love the way they make you stick to their particular answers, which is why we've decided to take it into our own model. So again, this is a decision between expediency, which I understand. If I was a CISO and I didn't have a lot of resources and a lot of time, I might be inclined to just use this as is, right? And do you see how you could do that, Ted?
Yeah, for sure.
You could use that today. And again, a lot of people don't know they've done this. That said, what we've done is taken this column, which is the way NIST talks, and we talked about this in our workshop as well, right? We said, one of the challenges is this is not really written necessarily in plain language to the same extent that you and I might if we were talking to a board or an executive team. It still speaks NIST. Now, it's pretty good in governance because they seem like they're plain language. But when you get down to the technical ones, holy smokes. This is not going to be language that boards and executive teams are used to using, right? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Although we probably would never share this with them.
Right. That's exactly, Ted, where we're heading. This is the whole point of the workshop. So what we've done, so now we go back, all we've done, and this is the data model I was showing you, is turn this into language that executives understand. Look at how easy this phrase is. Has your company set, shared, and kept up-to-date statements about how much risk you're willing to take into like that? This is business language. So all we did, Ted, was lift the intention of NIST, put it into language that the business can understand so that there are no questions. We've stripped it of anything that might be technical or security centric. And this you can share.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the important thing underneath this was, and we're just going to do a couple of examples. So you may recall during the workshop, when we say yes to these, it opened up what I called a maturity model. Now, a maturity model is asking you what the particular things are that made you answer. Okay, and I don't know why it's not. Let's see. See if I can get. It's not opening up my. All right, there we go. Okay, so underneath this, one of the challenges in any security maturity audit which you can do yourself, or you can have somebody, you can hire somebody to do. So whether you hire us to do it, sometimes the reason you hire a third party, by the way, is so that the board or the peer group will imagine that we've held you to account in terms of how you answer these things. One of the benefits of NIST is if you're sophisticated enough as a CISO and you have an internal team, you can do this yourself, because you can use this model to figure out and describe for yourselves the specific things that you believe contribute to answering something in the affirmative, right? So if you look down some of these, you can see that they must be drawn from somewhere, right? We didn't make this up, Ted, because we can't do a percentage model. So let's just go ahead and say that, you know, you were a good guy and you had all of these covered and there was no pulling the wool over your eyes, okay? Well, you'll see all of a sudden that you got credit for all the things you're currently doing. And you are already at a 0.9 on the very first standard. Now, how did we do that? Well, let me show you how. What we did is we went, let's go back to NIST, and let's go to the framework. Here it is. Let's read the document. So we're going to go in, we're going to click on read the document, just like I showed you before, and we're going to go to another source of gold. Now the source of gold is buried about 4 pages in. So down here on the 4th page, this is gold. All you have to do is click through and look at implementation examples. Now, why this is so important is none of this existed in NIST 1.0, and none of it, Ted, is yet available in Canada. So I'm going to tell you why there's an advantage for you using this. If you're US clients, it's perfect. If you're Canadian or Mexican, it will still work, because neither of Canada nor Mexico have yet done this. So I'm just going to click on these so you can see what they look like. Wow. Now this started way down in D because it pops up, but let's go back up to governance. Well, here you go. What NIST has done is taken, for the first time ever, the broad standard in the framework. So over here, you'll see that this is GVOC, and then there are, if we look, we can count. So there are 5. So there are 5 substandards under the first governance standards. That makes sense so far? So we have the category and subcategory. Do you see that, Ted?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
Then you have a specific 1 or more examples in each of the 5. Now, the good news about these is we have found these to be fairly succinct. They're written in language that most people can, I think, Ted, we would agree, can understand. You see that?
Yeah.
So how do you develop a scoring model? So Ted, if you were stuck with all this, what might you do? Well, what you could do is you could count how many subcategories there were for the governance standard, and you could divide into 100, couldn't you?
Yeah.
And that would tell you that, now it assumes an equal weight, but for a second, let's just assume you want it to be fairly simple. So again, back to what we talked about, there's no one size fits all. I'm not here to give you a list of metrics that matter, but I sure can do this for you. And this was the point of the workshop. You can now use the NIST framework to figure out very specifically what are factors that do contribute to meeting the governance standard. You could divide those into the percentage of 100, and you could calculate how, whether you said you were or you were not doing these, you could turn on or off of, flip a switch if you like, Ted, right? And you just add them up. And now it's just a sum of how many of those practices are we covering to a sufficient level that we are convinced that we can take credit for that as a mitigating factor. And
Right.
that's
You're
what
trying to
you're
come
doing.
up with a maturity level or indicator
For yourself.
for
Yes.
our organization. Yeah.
And the beauty of starting with this is that you can also add language that is specific to your industry. So this is the other thing we always encourage. So clients who get us to do this work for them, so the folks who are here today understand that. What we do is we give you this model and let you edit it. And what's really cool about that is that you are, and do you see it on the screen in front of you? It's on the screen, right? You're all seeing it right in front of you.
Yeah.
Take this and then you make it your own. So what you do is you go ahead and take these and you turn it into language and industry specific language and develop a scoring model. So when I said in my workshop that everybody needs to take this into their own context, this is what I meant. This is a starting point. So if you get us to do it, we turn over the spreadsheet so you can do that, but you could do it yourself, build it yourself. You could hire somebody to build it, hire us to do it. Doesn't really matter. But my point is the understanding of this, once you get this, there is no better model that has more credibility with your executive team and board than this one, because it is drawn from a credible model that everybody can understand. And then you're not inventing, you're not inventing some magical scoring model that nobody understands.
It would be good for our auditors as well.
Excellent. It's
This
excellent
level
for
of due
internal
diligence.
yes.
Yeah.
It's excellent for internal auditors. It's excellent for external auditors. Suddenly you are dealing with a model that is entirely referenceable to the world's leading cybersecurity standard.
Mhm. Yeah, I like it.
Okay. So that is how we have done it. And of course, we've done it for all of these. So the reason I wanted to avoid some of the vendor-driven, like whether you're talking about SAFE or security scorecard, the problem with using a vendor and their own scoring model is they will frequently not tell you how they've come up with the scoring model, right? They frequently keep that as proprietary or the secret sauce, and they just expect you to put answers in and a score tumbles out. And if the board or the executive team ask you, well, why are we this or why are we that? You don't know. You say, well, because that's what the tool said. Well, that's not a good answer. That in my view erodes our credibility as the person sitting in the chair responsible for security and the well-being of the company. So I think that gives everybody a much greater insight into the value of what I was talking about around developing your own data model, finding data sources, using reliable sources, not using a proprietary scoring model. I really wanted to take this extra hour with all of you and give you some really deep additional insight into how we do this work so that you too can do it for yourself. Or if you're going to hire somebody to do it, you can look for people who understand this, or maybe to avoid you falling into the trap of presuming that if you buy a pre-programmed tool like Security Scorecard or SAFE, that you're going to get all the answers. You're not. And unfortunately, because they use proprietary scoring and data models, I think it erodes rather than enhances your credibility. So any questions? So I'm going to stop sharing. I wanted to give you about 45 minutes of pretty good content. And then I wanted to stop and see whether there are any additional questions arising either from our original workshop or from today's session.
So
I'm happy to linger.
I've got a question, James, if that's all right. Going back to the initial dashboard for your report, it comes out with a total amount.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Now
I'll
this is
yeah,
and this is what we would communicate to our executive and board to say this quantifies the financial risk to the organization.
Yes. So what happens is you'll see that if we were to go in to govern, I'd have to do it, Ted, but if I were to go in and start to fill this in with any rapidity, when you went back to this original thing,
dynamically adjust it.
You got it. So all it's going to do is superimpose the level of mitigation that the maturity of your program brings to the table and impose it strictly on likelihood and breach. Now, what that allows you to do is to not only claim the due reward for your effort to date, it allows you to establish how much from raw score to likely, right? So have we got our risk down into the tolerance we want? You understand how we do that, right? By asking whether the maturity of our practices has given us enough mitigation to get us to the point where we feel like we're within the tolerances, and if not, you could go look at the things that were not checked in these. So this is the real value of a tool like this. You can actually go down the list and you could determine, like, let's just go pick one, maybe we'll go into one where there's a specific, let's see, we do this one. Let's take as an example this one, and we'll pop it down so it pops up. And you say, well, we're not doing any of this. Well, what you can do is you can tick this and determine your score and the percentage that that would give you. And it's going to take a second for, all right. What this is doing is saying, well, listen, would a complete filling in of this, would it be worthwhile? How much would it cost us? And how much did it impact? And how much did it add? And this is getting into the details of what I call the ROSI, or the return on security investment. This gives you a discernible way to take a look at not only your existing maturity, but what it would take to increase that maturity, and compare it to the amount of probability and impact on cost that you would get by doing that. That is something that many security teams struggle with. They can't really identify the specific math underlying what an additional tool, program, project to achieve this objective would do. And of course, it's much easier. Governance is a little harder, but if we were to go over, Ted, and look at some of the ones in identify, protect, or detect, as an example, how much should we invest in detect and protect? And because those tools can be expensive. How much value would we get out of them? How much would it cut the probability or the cost of an attack? So that's exactly how you use this model in the real world.
Yeah, no, it's good. Couple more questions, couple thoughts here. So what one is, right now we use a COBIT framework, self-assessment. That is the same sort of thing. It comes up with a maturity level. To get from a 0 to a 2 may not be that resource intensive. But to go from a 4 to a 5 could be significant. So part of, in a conversation with my colleagues, is trying to find what's that appropriate level of investment. And I guess it's risk acceptance.
Yeah, so it's back to the tolerance. So the only way to answer that, Ted, is to go back to the beginning and say, okay, first of all, where do we want our cost and probability to be? Like, what are we willing to run as a risk for the organization, right? Because if you're already getting there in what you're doing, the obvious answer should be, we shouldn't actually try to make those investments necessarily, because we feel like we're within the tolerances. If we aren't, then the question is, how far away are we from where we need to be comfortable? And then you go from top to bottom in terms of highest impact for lowest cost, right? So what you're looking for is the highest risk mitigation for the lowest cost. Now, that sounds like a simple answer, and it is. It's simple to do if you have this. It's not quite as simple in COBIT, and I'll tell you why. I think COBIT suffers from the 80-20 rule. In some ways, what they've done is extracted the practices that we believe work, and I think that it's a pretty good model. I don't mind it. But it's only going to cover a portion of this. And here's the issue you're going to face with both legal teams and accounting teams. If you're hit in a breach and the standard is NIST, or and I've forgotten what the Canadian equivalent's called, Ted, to NIST, but it's it escapes me, but I think
we generally use CIS, but we also use NIST as well. Yeah.
But those are American, but there's a Canadian equivalent to NIST, but it just escapes me. But anyway, so whether you're using NIST or CIS doesn't matter. The benefit of using NIST, the underlying one, as opposed to COBIT or CIS or any of the extractions from NIST, is that you 100% know that you can report on a percentage basis how much of this maturity you've achieved with no gaps that somebody could drive a legal or auditing truck through. So it's more work to do it off this model, because CIS and COBIT are both easier because they have fewer factors. They group them better. I think they're easier to use, but they do leave some gaps that an auditor or a legal team might question you quite significantly about. So there is some value. This is a lot of work to do, but it's a lot of upfront work to do once. Then once it's done, you never have to do it again.
Yeah. One final question here. So breach impact, 2.8 million.
Yep. And these are US dollars, of
versus,
course.
versus 3.8 million. I could hear maybe some of my board saying to them, it's all the same. It's more than they're willing to accept.
Right.
And we've gone to a lot of work to try to get that breach impact to a to a level that we could say this is
To a
actually
tolerance.
validated.
Yep. To a tolerance that they can accept. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the question then is, other than to say it's significant,
Well, let me do it slightly differently. Of course, your number wouldn't be 2.8. By the time you went through the tool and you showed the maturity, because you run we know you run a good shop. By the time you superimpose maturity, that number is going to fall relatively dramatically, and it will likely come for most of my clients. It'll come within a tolerance. But here's what's interesting: that your question belies something I encounter all the time. Boards and executive teams tend to perseverate on the cost in the same way they perseverate on your budget, by the way.
Yeah.
Hard numbers are easier discussions to have than the breach probability. And what people forget is that this is frequently known as a flaw in the way we do this, because you could actually have more than one breach event. So if you have one, the research says you have almost double the risk of having another one in the next 6 months because you end up being targeted by people, right? So there's a real escalation of your posture with a single breach. So because this is a critical event model, right? This is looking at a probabilistic model. So you're taking the breach likelihood times the cost to get to the likely probabilistic cost of an event.
Mm-hmm.
What if you had more than one? Suddenly getting it to $400,000 or $500,000 or $600,000, everybody goes, oh, well, we can handle that. But what if you had 2 attacks or 3 attacks? So there is a need to make sure that we don't lose the focus on both numbers, because you have to put a multiplication sign between those 2 boxes, right, Ted? You have to have probability of a breach times cost. And then ask yourself the question, are we absolutely certain we would only have 1 in a year? And nobody can answer that question. Hopefully you have 0. So the probability is not 0, but you could end up over a period of time having several years in a row where you have no breach, or you had a near death experience, a close to breach that you managed to, your maturity helped you detect or avoid or mitigate. So again, it's still tricky, because if we're really good at what we do, sometimes our executive teams and our boards can become a bit immune to this information, because it's sort of like, well, okay, we know we have to go through the exercise, but Ted, you always keep us safe. Well, that's really good until the day you're not safe.
Yeah. Yeah. If I said our financial risk calculated at 2.8 million.
Yep.
However, if I had an additional 600,000 per year to invest, here's
what it would do.
How I could reduce it.
Yep.
That would mean something to them. And then they have a decision to make to say,
correct.
Are we okay with this risk and not changing it at all? Or do we want to invest more to bring that down?
Yes. And the most important thing about your question and your comment, Ted, and we said this in the workshop, remember what I said, the most important thing is leading them through the conversation. The decisions are ultimately out of our hands. Our job is to educate the executive team and the board. It is their job to make decisions. Our job is to provide reliable information. We've not had nearly as much of that until recently. These implementation examples that I showed you give you a specific way of assessing your organization's maturity, whether you do that yourself or using an outside assessment or audit team. The point is the same. Now we have very specific ways of providing that information in a concrete method with absolute reliability, and now they can't ignore it. This is no longer a conversation of hypotheticals. And I think that's the big point of the workshop that we had. When I said cybersecurity metrics that matter, what I mean is these matter because it puts them squarely on the hot seat to make the decision you just said, Ted.
For sure. Super helpful. Thank you for sharing all of this.
Well, thank
We
you.
can dig into it. Yeah.
Great. I appreciate you all being here today. And if you have any questions, of course, in follow-up after you view if you attended the workshop or if you view the workshop, please let us know. With that, I'm going to sign off, and Pat, I'm going to let you stop recording, and we will circulate this to you. Watch your inboxes for it.